Chapter 176, 1983. 6th of June, 1983. Sometimes I wonder if you're using me, Grant said one afternoon in the summer of 1983. We all use each other, Remus replied dryly. And that's what we think love is. Christ, I can't talk to you when you're like this, Grant sighed heavily, reaching for a packet of cigarettes on the bedside table. Like what? A gloomy git. Grant pulled a long white cylinder from the box with his teeth, and Remus lit it with his wand end. Grant sucked on it appreciatively, settling back into Remus's body in the crook of his arm. Remus lazily stroked Grant's collarbone until it was his turn to smoke. They'd almost given up. Sharing a quick post-sex fag was their treat. Sorry, Remus said. I don't mean to be gloomy. Pfft, Grant replied cheerfully. Bleed gloomy if you want. I'm only teasing ya. Grant made everything so easy. Remus could barely remember when their relationship had grown into what it was now. It had started with the regular visits, after that first intervention. They'd grown more frequent, and eventually Grant was just there all the time. First he slept on the couch, and then he didn't anymore, and it was never discussed again. By midsummer 1982, he'd moved all his belongings in, such that they were. I travel light, he winked, shaking out a rucksack that contained a few clean pairs of underwear and some t-shirts. One sock, for God's sake. I'll give you some money, Remus said monotonously. You can go shopping. He still had a few £100 Sirius had converted to muggle money in case of emergencies. Remus didn't feel guilty about spending it. It was just sitting there. I'm not here to scrounge off ya, Grant insisted. I know, but you need clothes. Yes, Mum. I'll borrow some of yours for a bit till I get myself sorted. Fine. So Remus went to Debenhams by himself one afternoon and bought as much as he could in Grant's size. Jeans and t-shirts and underwear and socks and jumpers, pyjamas, and even a cheap pair of trainers that were on offer. Bright colours because Grant was a bright person, and Remus had seen enough black to last a lifetime. He folded it all away in the chest of drawers. It felt good to fill them. They'd been standing half empty for over a year. Grant wore the clothes, but they never discussed it. There were some things they could not avoid talking about, though. Remus hadn't been doing magic at all for the first few months. Actually, he found that he couldn't, a lot of the time, even when he tried. Perhaps the grief. All those funerals. It may have had more to do with his drinking, though he couldn't be sure. There was a block there, like a wall had gone up. He could apparate for full moons, but that was the extent of it. Then one day, it just came back, as if it never left him. They'd forgotten to pay the electric and the lights went dead. Without thinking, Remus lit his wand. Lumos! What the bloody fuck is that? Grant leapt away as if Remus had set himself on fire. Remus swallowed, then resigned himself to it. It's a magic wand. Are you high? Remus laughed, a gruff alien sound. I think I'd better explain some stuff to you. The school I went to was a bit different. He began to explain. He knew how weird it must all sound, and he had to leave quite a lot of stuff out. Almost 20 minutes later, Grant was staring at him, face pale in the weakening wand light. You're having me on, he laughed nervously. What are you playing at, making a load of tosh like that up? Grant, look. Remus made sparks with his wand. He levitated the coffee table, and then, showing off because it had been so long, transformed his mug into a frog. All right, Grant recoiled as the frog hopped onto the carpet. Okay, I believe you, Jesus Christ! Oh, just Remus Lupin will do. Remus stuck his tongue out. Then he stopped, realized what he was doing. He'd stopped hurting for a moment and chastised himself viciously for it. Your friends are dead and you're doing magic tricks for some muggle. Pathetic. He went to look in the cupboards for a drink. Oh no, don't, Grant said, sounding disappointed. Remus returned to the couch with a bottle of vodka and 2 tumblers. He liked the vodka best. It went down easy. I don't want any, Grant said, ignoring the second glass. I'm going to stop getting it for you. Remus shrugged and knocked back his first measure. Grant sighed. So you're a wizard, eh? Does that mean Sirius was a wizard too? Remus nearly choked on his second shot, but got it down. His eyes watered and he nodded. Yeah, we all are. Were. And he drank more and told Grant about the war. He left out some of the more painful details, but Grant was astute and guessed the rest. Is that where you go off to every month? Grant asked. Some magic thing? Oh. No, there's something else. Bloody hell, Remus, do I know anything about you? Sorry, Remus said. Honestly, I'm not really worth the effort. Once you know everything, you'll understand. Try me, Grant said. So then they had the werewolf conversation. Remus explained what happened to him on full moons and how dangerous he was and where he went. Since you were 5?
Grant said aghast.
Yeah, Remus nodded nervously. You poor thing. Grant shook his head and stroked his hand. You've had a rough go of it, haven't you? Remus accepted the sympathy and didn't say too much about Castor, because he was ashamed of himself.
Not that Grant would have been jealous. Not like Sirius. Not like... Oh, no.
Oi! Back in the present, Grant snapped his fingers. He held up the cigarette half-smoked. Your turn, gorgeous. Sorry. Remus took it and inhaled deeply. Ah, they were still in bed. Everything was okay. Everything is okay. You drifted away from me there, Grant commented without accusation. Sorry, Remus said again. Penny for 'em? Oh, nothing. Just thinking. He stubbed out the cigarette. Fucking hell, he missed smoking. Well, Grant rolled over, lying half on top of Remus, face centimetres away. That's no good, is it? I was trying to stop you from thinking. You do, Remus smiled. They kissed, friendly at first, then deeper. Remus slid his hands up Grant's long body. Want to try again? Grant smiled against his lips, murmuring, You just want another fag, don't you? I want you, too. Well, tough luck. Grant pulled away, pushing himself off Remus off the bed. Last shift at the pub starts in 40 minutes. Already gonna have to leg it. Do you have to? Remus flopped back on the bed, petulant. Oh, don't whinge, princess. It's only one more evening. Oi, be good and stay off the booze, and I'll do something really nice when I get in. I'll be asleep. I'll wake you up. Remus smirked. Okay, then. Grant made everything so easy. He tried to stay off the drink that night, he really did. But he needed something, or else how would he ever sleep? And he definitely didn't smoke, so that was pretty good. He wanted to be good, for Grant's last night at the pub. After getting 3 A-levels in social policy, politics and education, then studying for months for further exams, Grant had qualified as a social worker. He was beginning a placement at a boys' remand centre the following week. Remus didn't know where he got the balls for it. It'll be like going to St. Edmund's all over again. No, it won't. Grant smiled. It'll be different, because I'll make it different. They were pretty happy together. They had their moments anyway, but they were always friends before lovers, and neither of them were faithful. Grant had plenty of other boyfriends in his never-ending quest for variety. They might be arty types with long hair and camp affectations, or earnest political sorts in baggy khaki fatigues and thick-knitted jumpers, campaigning for nuclear disarmament or gay and lesbian rights, or the miners or something. Remus watched them come and go with a distant interest. He didn't begrudge Grant. He knew he was hardly a barrow of laughs to begin with. Remus himself had become excellent at dividing his life up into neat segments with razor-sharp edges. Castor was a bad habit. Grant was everything else. Then there was Sirius's spectre, looming over the whole thing, making sure he was never really happy with either of them. You could stay, brother, Castor said every time. Can you not call me brother right after you've been fucking me? Remus snapped. He was often rude to Castor, and Castor was rough with him right back. Remus wasn't sure if it was a wolf thing or a self-punishment thing, but he tried not to analyze the arrangement too much. Remus Lupin, then, Castor replied. It's just Remus, he grunted, getting up to dress himself. And you know I can't stay. I've got a life back in England. You say that, Castor raised an eyebrow, but I see no evidence. We would care for you here. I don't trust any of you as far as I could throw you, Remus said flatly, buttoning up his jeans. And yet you return every month. Yeah, well, that's just for this. Remus gestured at Castor's naked body, reclining back on grey furs. He was absolutely perfect in every way, a Greek statue, lithe and muscular and delicious. Let's not start pretending we like each other. But we are your pack, Castor protested. Look, I'll stop coming at all if you won't leave off. Remus gritted his teeth. He did stop going, for 2 months after that, just to make Castor suffer. Remus didn't need a pack, and he certainly didn't need friends. Sometimes Mary tried to get in touch, sometimes he let her. But it was very hard, so very hard. He preferred Grant and their modest mugglish life together. And really, though their life was not one Remus had ever imagined living, it was hardly empty. Remus took up various odd jobs, cleaning mostly, or courier work, because it was cash in hand. No one cared if he stopped showing up. Grant studied for his license and always had students around, debating in the living room, preparing for another protest against poll tax or for nuclear disarmament. They made a huge mess of the living room, painting banners and nailing together placards, but Remus didn't mind a bit of chaos. He liked the girls Grant invited over better than he liked the boys. They were all so vibrant, so passionate, with punky green hair and boyish, mischievous attitudes. He didn't care much for their causes, but the conversation was always lively. At times he felt like he was speaking to Mary or Marlene or Lily. Then he would slow down, and he'd need a drink. He would stand quietly in the kitchen until they all left. Oh, Remus, you can't wander off and get pissed every time you're sad. Grant sighed one night when he found Remus slumped over the kitchen table, hours after everyone left. I am sad, Remus sobbed. I know you are, mate. Grant bent down and pulled Remus's arm over his shoulder, hoisting him up towards bed. And you're allowed to be sad. It's the drink we've got a problem with, eh?
No one owes you a happy life, Remus mournfully parroted Matron's old adage as they swayed down the hall together. No, Grant huffed, settling him into bed. He looked down at Remus pityingly. But you owe yourself one, love.
Chapter 177, 1985. Remus liked a lot of things about Grant. His smile, his corkscrew blonde curls, his brash, unapologetic sense of humour. Grant was a likeable person. But there was one thing Remus absolutely refused to tolerate. Grant loved football. He wasn't a fanatic, but he definitely had more of an interest than Remus really felt was necessary. He supported Queen's Park Rangers, and even bought himself a knockoff kit t-shirt one year, plus the blue and white striped scarf. Never one who simply observed, Grant was an occasional gambler too, and on Saturdays he played on a gay men's team away down in South London. That was how he met Neil Newman, a tall, good-looking football player with spiky hair and thighs you could crack walnuts on.
And how Remus met Anthea Luong, Neil's part-time girlfriend.
Part-time? Remus raised an eyebrow when Grant explained. He was tying up his bootlaces, ready to go for practice one Saturday, and Neil was coming to pick him up. It's not that unusual. Grant winked at him. Remus took the point. But if Neil's queer, Remus tried. Grant lifted a finger. Get with the times, sunshine. Queer's out. We are gay men, and we are proud. Remus rolled his eyes. Whatever. If Neil's a gay man, then how does Anthea fit in? I reckon he must be bicentennial.
You mean bisexual? Remus corrected.
No, he's 200 years old. Grant poked his tongue out. Yes, Mr. Literal, bisexual.
Remus couldn't really blame Neil for that, once he'd met her too.
Anthea was a very attractive girl. She was tiny and springy, with long satin black hair and glittering eyes. Her mouth was like a rosebud, and she had the most beautiful skin Remus had ever seen. She dressed like Cyndi Lauper, all frills and dayglow. So nice to meet ya, she grinned, stretching up on her tippy toes to kiss Remus's cheek in greeting. Neil just gave him a slightly wary nod. Remus was used to that from Grant's paramours. Tea, everybody? Grant offered. Nah, we'd better get going, Neil said rather pointedly, Remus thought. Want to get there early, don't we? Warm up. Is that what you call it? Anthea stuck her tongue out at him. Remus, can I stay here with you? I've got so much I want to talk to you about. You have? He stared at her, alarmed. He hadn't even known Neil had a girlfriend until 10 minutes ago. Oh, yeah, I told Anth how good you are at astrology, Grant said cheerfully, pulling his denim jacket on. It looked silly in shorts and long socks, but everything football-related was ridiculous to Remus. Astronomy, Remus said. Very different things. Saw stars and that, innit? Well, he didn't really have an argument. See you, lads. Have fun. And Thea waved at them both, pushing them out the door. Suddenly Remus was alone with a strange young woman, with no idea why. He really wanted to drink. You don't have a TV? She said flatly. No, Remus agreed. Great flat, though, she was saying, walking around the room, looking out of the window, pulling books off the shelf and scanning covers. So nice you live in Chinatown. Do you speak Chinese? No. I do. I speak 3 languages, actually. Chinese, Vietnamese, and English. English is my mother tongue. Vietnamese is my mother's tongue, if you get me. She winked at him. And Neil always says I ought to say I speak 4 languages, because I chat so much shit. She laughed. It was a bit of an ugly, jangly laugh, like coins falling on sheet metal, but she laughed with such conviction that it was endearing anyway. Right, Remus nodded. Sorry, did you want to know something about astronomy? Maybe. I'm a Virgo. What are you? Pisces, I think. Do they go together? She asked. He blinked. No, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, that's astrology, not... Neil's a Capricorn and they don't go with Virgos. I checked. I always check. But you know the heart wants what it wants, doesn't it? You know they're shagging, she said out of nowhere. Him and Grant. I guess. Do you mind it? You're Grant's live-in, aren't you? Remus nodded, though he privately corrected her. Grant was his live-in, not the other way around. We're pretty casual, though. Oh, that's good, she nodded earnestly. Look, how long are you staying? Remus scratched his head awkwardly. Just till the boys get back from footy, she smiled. That's okay, innit? Grant said you'd like the company. Oh, I tell you what, I'd love a cup of tea. Okay. He went to put the kettle on, still confused. What was Grant playing at, leaving him to babysit his lover's girlfriend? As if Remus had nothing better to do on a Saturday. He'd planned to read the paper. Maybe catch up with the Archers on the radio. No sugar, no milk, Anthea called. Ooh, can I put a record on? If you like. She put on a Queen album. Remus sighed to himself. He wasn't really a fan, but Grant couldn't get enough. When he brought the tea through, Anthea was sitting on the couch, leaning over the coffee table, rolling a joint. She grinned at him. Fancy it? Go on then, Remus agreed. Well, that was better than nothing. They smoked and drank tea and listened to Queen, and Anthea rabbited on, asking all sorts. Grant says you're really clever. Private school and everything. Yeah, Remus shrugged. And you know all about constellations and things like that. Hey, can I read your tarot cards if you like? No, thanks. How come you've got all those scars?
He blinked, caught off guard. She was still smiling prettily, and seemed genuinely curious about him.
Just got a lot of scars, he said, swallowing. Do you fancy a gin and tonic? He didn't actually have tonic, but he could pretend he'd just forgotten and take it neat. Yeah, why not? She nodded brightly. He got up and she followed him into the kitchen, still talking. You're not ill or anything, then? No, Remus said. I got them fighting. Some of them I did myself. Oh, you poor thing, she said, her sympathy genuine. She leaned forward and squeezed his arm kindly. Sorry to ask, love. You just can't be too careful nowadays. Do you know what I mean? He poured the gin into 2 tumblers. He did know exactly what she meant, and he didn't want to talk about it, or think about it. She didn't complain when he handed her a tumbler of straight gin, just clicked their glasses together and beamed. Cheers! Then took a good gulp. They went back to the couch. Remus took the bottle. You're ever so tall, Remus. What are you, 6'3"? 6'2". I love tall men, she purred. Me too. Anthea laughed at that. Her plastic earrings clicked together. She chatted even more, telling him silly, nonsense things about herself, when she'd been to school, her favourite songs on the radio, every film she'd ever seen at the pictures. And I love a bit of dancing too. That's how I met Neil, dancing in the Vauxhall. Shall I show you? Okay, you have to picture me in this sparkly purple dress, right? And my hair was shorter then. She got up and began to dance to the record. Remus didn't need to see the picture of the sparkly dress. She was a very good dancer. She twisted and wriggled with sensual energy, throwing flirtatious looks at him and flicking her hips. Stoned and relaxed, Remus slouched on the sofa watching her. She was dreamlike, pretty and graceful, but so overwhelmingly and unignorably real. Remus wondered why he always ended up stuck with chatterboxes, and why on earth he liked it so much. The song ended and she held her arms aloft like a gymnast who'd just completed a perfect routine. Remus smiled despite himself and applauded. "Fancy a dance?" She fluttered her eyes flirtatiously. Remus couldn't help it. Whatever she'd rolled him was stronger than what he was used to, and he was charmed by her. "Go on, then." He didn't really dance, but he held her hands as she did, twirling her in the right places and letting her fall into his arms, giggling. She had the most delicate wrists, the bones fine like a bird's. When they finally collapsed on the couch to smoke another joint, she kicked off her shoes and laid her legs over his lap. Grant did that sometimes. They only had the one sofa, so it was the only way to stretch out. "You're very handsome, Remus," she said through the smoke. "Ah," he replied, knocking back the last of his gin. He couldn't pour any more without pushing her legs off, and he didn't want to do that, so he just settled for the joint. "You are. You're very sexy." "Shh," he chuckled. "Who do you think you are, showing up in my flat unannounced and interrogating me?" "Am I interrogating you?" She widened her eyes. "Are you succumbing to my techniques?" Remus laughed, creasing over, his hands on her legs. They were so smooth and soft. She was giggling too, watching him. Her eyes were so dark and so full of life. He wanted her. Remus realized it all of a sudden, like a light being turned on. The room was brighter, her face clearer. Bloody hell. He finished the joint. She wriggled down on the couch and closed her eyes contentedly. He left his hands on her legs, just resting there. He didn't want to grab her or anything awful like that. He just wanted... What? What did you do with a girl? Mary was almost a decade ago, and it wasn't as if Remus had really played much of a role there. He'd mostly just felt surprised she'd picked him. He felt like that now, too, as Anthea opened her eyes and smiled at him again. "Sorry, do you want to lay down too?" "What?" Remus's back prickled, alarmed. Were they really going to? "No, I mean, You're so lovely," she grinned, shifting aside and pulling him down beside her. "Let's just lie together for a bit. It's nice, isn't it?" She put her arm across him. Her soft black hair tickled under his nose, and he couldn't help but inhale her scent. It was warm and sort of spicy, like clove or cinnamon. He liked it. They lay for a bit like that. The record had finished and was just turning on its needle, cracking. "What do you think Grant and Neil are doing now?" Anthea whispered, her hand suddenly on his belt, palm flat against his crotch. "Probably in the showers, you reckon?" Remus said, speechless. "You ought to see Neil with his kit off. He's an Adonis. I mean, he's a dickhead, but you can forget all about it when he gets going. I bet they're all sweaty and muddy from the pitch." Remus tried to regulate his breathing, but she kept moving her hand, and he was finding it hard to concentrate on anything else. Finally, she looked up at him and kissed his lips very tenderly. "Do you fancy it?" "Yeah," Remus breathed. "Go on, then." Anthea was in the shower 2 hours later when Grant and Neil walked in the door. Remus was still sprawled on the couch in his underpants, flushed and completely stunned. Grant did a double take, then burst out laughing. Neil looked appalled. He marched into the bathroom and demanded Anthea get out at once. "You slag!" Grant wheezed at Remus, doubled over laughing. "Bye, Grant. Bye, Remus," Anthea called as she and Neil hurried out. He had a face like thunder, and the door slammed hard behind them. Well then, Grant said, composing himself. I hope your girlfriend hasn't used up all the hot water. I really don't know why it happened, Remus said, pulling his t-shirt on. We were just listening to records and she was talking and then... What, it was the only way to shut her up? Remus looked at him sheepishly. Believe it or not, it didn't shut her up. It took Grant 10 full minutes to pull himself together. They got a TV a few weeks after that.
Grant joked that if Remus was so bored he'd resorted to shagging girls, then they'd better bring in some entertainment for him.
He didn't see Anthea again, which was a pity, because to be honest, Remus wouldn't have minded making that a regular thing. Once you got used to all the talking, she was very sexy. He didn't think about what it meant too much, and Grant didn't push it. The TV came second-hand. Neither of them had enough disposable income for a brand new one. They got it free off a friend of Grant's, in the condition that they picked it up themselves. It was only 2 streets over, but that still presented something of a problem. Can't you hover it home or summit? Grant asked, hands on his hips as they stared down at the big, bulky TV set on the pavement. Do a spell? It's against the law, Remus explained. In public, anyway, or in front of you. Grant raised a hand to push his hair out of his sweaty face. Bugger. Knew I ought to learn how to drive. The door of the building opened and a man walked out, looking flushed and shifty. That was the 3rd man Remus had seen with exactly the same furtive look. What is this place, anyway? He asked, peering up at the building. It looked like all the others, maybe a bit shabby. There was no outward signage. Sorta, Grant said, squatting down to see if he could get his arms round the set. He could, but there was no way he could lift the thing. Sauna? Remus scratched his head. You know, a bathhouse, where men can be alone together and get all sweaty. Oh! Remus gaped, embarrassed. Christ, Remus, we do live in Soho. I know, Anyway, don't lift it like that, you'll do your back in. Come on, take that end, I'll take this. 1, 2, 3, up! They got it back in about 30 minutes, only taking 1 break. Remus was really doing most of the carrying, but he didn't mind. They'd picked a day between the moons, and he was feeling pretty healthy. Luckily, Grant was a dab hand at the electrical side and managed to hook up everything once the TV was actually in the living room. It looked weird. A big black plastic tube taking up all the space. They ended up putting it on a box in front of the fireplace, which they never used anyway. The aerial wasn't brilliant and needed a bit of electrical tape to keep it upright, but once they'd switched the thing on and the fuzzy picture came into view, they were both hooked. Remus, who hadn't watched any telly in years, was a complete addict that summer. He got hooked on soaps, EastEnders, Brookside, and Coronation Street, but he'd watch anything. Debates in the House of Commons, snooker championships, comedy, documentaries, Top of the Tops, and even a horrifically upsetting series called Threads, about the threat of nuclear war. The TV went on first thing in the morning as he pottered around the flat getting dressed or brushing his teeth, and more often than not he fell asleep in front of it in the evenings. Grant started calling the set the other man.
I just like the noise, Remus said. For company.
You could try making some real friends, Grant said. Remus dismissed this. He didn't need friends. He had everything he needed. One Sunday afternoon they were both in the living room. Remus had to leave for a cleaning job which started at 3 a.m, so he'd been sleeping most of the day. Grant was reading the paper, and Remus's legs were across his lap. With his free hand, Grant was absent-mindedly rubbing the arch of Remus's left foot, which was making Remus sleepy and dozy again. The news had just finished and they were waiting for the weather when suddenly sinister music began to play. There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all, the television said ominously. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. Grant and Remus both looked up to watch that creepy announcement, a word etched into a blackened gravestone. AIDS. Don't die of ignorance, the voiceover intoned. A familiar sense of shame and anxiety rushed through Remus, a sickly mix of emotion he hadn't felt since school. He pulled his feet off Grant, drawing his knees up to his chest. He felt dirty, untouchable. Christ, Grant said, his voice hollow, signalling to Remus that he was feeling exactly the same way. It's enough to make you give up on shagging altogether, isn't it? He shook his head. Remus bit his lip. "You're being safe, aren't you?" he asked tentatively. "Yeah, obviously," Grant nodded brusquely. Remus looked up at him, twisting his mouth. He hated bringing up Grant's other liaisons, and Grant was always very discreet about it. Not guilty or secretive, but discreet. Still, Remus wanted to be sure as he could. "Good. I mean, you're using..." Grant stood up, hands on his hips, clearly annoyed. "Yes, Remus, when I fuck other men, I make sure there are condoms handy." "Sorry," Remus blushed, looking down at his own hands. "It's none of my business." "Right, it's not." Grant snapped, agitated, and went into the kitchen. Remus heard him feel the kettle, then flick it on. Then he smelled cigarette smoke. He ran his hands through his hair, flustered, and called through the wall. I couldn't bear it if I didn't have you." Quiet. Footsteps. "What about you?" Grant asked, reappearing. "Me?" Remus blinked. Grant folded his arms, leaning in the doorframe. "Don't treat me like an idiot. I'm not your one and only, and it wasn't just ham fever. Whoever you see whenever you go off every month, when you're not yourself." Remus stared at him, his mouth dry. He blinked again and nodded. "I'll be safe." "Couldn't do without you either," Grant said, ruffling Remus's hair. "Insensitive wanker. Cup of tea?" Remus nodded, glad they weren't fighting, but troubled all the same. Grant was quite right, of course. Remus had never given protection a second thought with Castor. Could wizards get it? If they could, then was there a magical cure? Remus had seen pictures of AIDS sufferers from America, skeletal men in hospital beds. He shuddered. Grant came back through with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Remus, then sat down beside him, crossed his legs, and raised the mug to his lips, blowing on it. He sipped, then looked up thoughtfully. "I could stop." "Huh?" Remus blinked, lost in his own thoughts. "I could stop seeing other people," Grant repeated patiently. "If you wanted me to, I mean. All you have to do is ask." "I don't want to tell you what you can and can't." "Remus?" Grant raised an eyebrow. "I've been living here for 4 years. You're a right dickhead sometimes, but you make me happy." Remus was staring at the carpet now, trying not to panic. Grant set down his tea and reached over to touch Remus's hand. "I don't need anyone but you," he said sincerely. "Grant, I know. Grant put a hand up. "I'm not expecting you to say it back. It's okay. I know how you feel, and that's enough." Remus inhaled sharply and closed his eyes. He exhaled slowly and willed his heart to slow down. It was a lovely thing to hear. He had never for a moment expected to feel this way again, or for it to be so very different from the last time. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay?" Grant cocked his head. "Okay," Remus nodded. "I'd rather you didn't see anyone else." "Deal." Chapter 178, 1986.
Things were different, of course, after Remus and Grant agreed to remain monogamous.
They were still best friends, they still made each other laugh and irritated each other beyond belief, but a fresh new closeness had developed too.
Remus drank less for a while. He didn't stop altogether, and some days were very hard. Some days he didn't wash, or get out of bed, or eat, but not every day, and that was progress.
Castor didn't take it well. In fact, he was furious. Remus even tried to explain HIV to him, but it was no good. Castor had grown so far away from his humanity, he was even starting to look wolfish. His hair was thicker, blacker somehow, and extended down past the nape of his neck, creeping along his spine. His teeth were lengthening, his eyes sharper, the irises turning yellow.
"You're turning your back on your family, Remus Lupin," he snarled. "Even your magic grows weaker." "I'm not turning my back on anything," Remus insisted. "I'm trying to have a real life."
Of course, Castor didn't understand.
Remus kept Castor and Grant so separate that they didn't even know each other's names. Maybe he'd always known he'd have to pick one of them in the end, and Castor had never felt right. In the end, Remus was banished from the pack. He was warned that if he ever returned, he would be treated as a threat. This was extreme, but he supposed that was what you got for breaking a werewolf's heart. Now Remus had to spend the full moons in Britain. He had returned to some of his old haunts, the Lake District, the Brecon Beacons. He tried not to go anywhere where there were too many memories of Prongs and Wormtail, or the other one. To make matters worse, without the pack to help him heal every month, Remus had to apparate back to London and tend to his wounds as best he could. "Christ!" Grant exclaimed the first time it was really bad. He walked in on Remus in the bathroom, disinfecting his cuts, his wand shaking as he tried to grip it with broken fingers. "Sorry," Remus murmured, bracing himself against the sink as a dizzy spell threatened to overwhelm him. He hadn't felt so dreadful after a transformation since... His vision clouded, and he sat down on the closed toilet lid, head between his knees so he didn't faint. Remus sat there dumbly, letting himself be looked after, too tired to do much else. "For God's sake!" Grant shook his head, visibly upset. "We can't have you in this state every month, can we, my darling?" "It's okay," Remus muttered. "This isn't too bad." "My arse!" Grant retorted, getting up to look for plasters in the medicine cabinet. He found them and knelt down again, resuming his work on Remus's scrapes. "Tell you what, if it's a choice between you coming back like this every month or giving that wolfy fucker a few blowjobs, then I'll do it myself." Remus laughed, which hurt his ribs. "I'm not sure it works like that." "Well, we've got to do something," Grant grumbled, binding Remus's broken fingers tightly together with the plasters. "You're good at this," Remus said, surprised, looking down at the neat work Grant had made. "Yeah, well, if you get battered as much as I've been, you pick up a few tricks." Grant looked up and winked. "And don't forget I went on that first aid course for work. Come on then, let's get you to bed. Are you hungry?"
Sort of. He was starving, but he knew there was no food in. They were waiting for payday to do a big shop. "I'll see what I can do," Grant said, helping him through the bedroom. "You don't have to. I'll probably just sleep." "God, you look so pale." Grant felt Remus's forehead with the back of his hand. "I think you ought to eat something." "Honestly, I look worse than I feel." Remus climbed into bed, his bones wept with relief. "Don't believe you." Grant got in with him and sat up, stroking Remus's hair. It was very soothing. Did Sirius used to look after you, after full moons?" Remus screwed his eyes up, shook his head. "Please don't. I can't." "Oh, love." Grant sighed, resuming his tender stroking. "You know, my friend who does the counselling, she says she'll give you an appointment. Just say the word. Help me a lot. You don't know how much." "I can't," Remus said. He always said the same. "There are too many lies I'd have to tell." "No, I've been thinking. It don't have to be about the war or even the wolf thing. Just talk to her about James and Lily and Peter. Say it was a car crash or..." "No! Remus, I just want you to talk. You know, I really don't feel well. Can you leave me alone, please?" "Fine." Grant got up. Remus kept his eyes shut, but he could hear every movement. Just before he left the room, Grant turned back. "I found that bottle of gin in your sock drawer, by the way. Poured it down the sink." He slammed the door. Ring, 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 ring. "Hello? Mary? Remus?" There was a brief silence on the end of the line as Mary collected herself. Remus knew that feeling. Sometimes he'd be reminded something from the old days, and it would knock all the air out of him. "Hi," she said, her voice carrying an overwide smile. "How are you, sweetheart?" "Oh, you know, I'm not disturbing you." He always tried to give her an easy out, if she wanted it. "Course not. Just had our tea." "Oh, nice. What did you have?" "Chicken and rice. Darren's favourite." "Sounds good." "You ought to come over for dinner one evening. Still in London, are you?" "Yeah, same flat." "Oh, of course. Is that... how is that?" "It's okay. he said, glancing round his shabby-looking living room. Been here so long now, I suppose it feels like it's always just been mine. Seeing anyone? Sort of. Working? Cleaning, off and on when I can get it. I was stacking shelves for a bit over in Epping, but I fell asleep on the job and they sacked me. Be gentle with yourself, love. Yeah. He took a drink from his beer bottle. How's your job? Good. Turns out I might have been awful at Transfiguration, but accounting is no big deal. Darren had opened a garage in 85, and Mary worked there too, taking care of all the bookings and the invoicing. They were saving up to move out of their tower block and get a little house with a garden. She only used magic very occasionally, she told Remus, though her relationship with her wand had never been quite the same since finding the McKinnons. Remus, are you still there? Yeah, sorry, drifted off. I did that too. A pause, and Remus got that sick, tight feeling in his stomach. He could guess what was coming next. Mary raised her voice slightly. Have you got someone to talk to? Whoever it is you're sort of seeing. Do they know what happened? Remus made a non-committal noise. Bits and pieces. Because you ought to talk about it, Remus. You shouldn't have to carry all of that. I can't imagine how it must feel. The betrayal. No! Remus snapped. You can't! And he slammed down the phone as hard as he could, so that he knocked it off the table. He finished his beer before moving to pick it up. Fuck her, then. Everyone wanted him to talk, but none of them really knew. None of them could know how stupid he felt, how used. Lily and James and Peter and Marlene. Losing them was one thing. Remus had taught himself to focus on the best memories, the happiest times. But Sirius. There was not one moment of their time together that wasn't tainted, poisoned by the lies Black had been telling. Remus had been open and vulnerable and loving, and every moment of it had been false. He'd been made a fool of by the only person he'd ever loved. He was pathetic.
Too blinded by emotion to see the truth, and now there was nothing left of him. He would never be capable of that kind of softness ever again.
Remus's hatred for Sirius was so overwhelming sometimes it frightened him. How was he supposed to talk about that? How was he supposed to tell Grant or some therapist that he was not merely angry, not merely grieving, but paralyzed by rage? That he sometimes dreamed of getting to Azkaban somehow and killing Sirius himself? That once or twice in the first few months after the war, he had gone so far as to actually get up in the night, drunk and furious, grabbed his wand and planned to do exactly that. The only thing that stopped him was the thought of getting splinched, or having to face all those Dementors. He kicked the coffee table furiously, stubbing his toe. Bugger! Grant poked his head round the corner of the living room door. Didn't go well, then? There's no point trying, Remus huffed, rubbing his foot and hopping across the room to flick on the TV. She's happy. She's got her life together. I should just leave her to it. He collapsed back on the sofa. Is that what she said? Grant came in reproachfully. No, but it's what's fair. Remus kept his eyes fixed on the screen, slouched down further. Maybe Grant would get the message. I don't want to talk. Why don't you invite her over one Saturday? Grant sat on the arm of the couch. I'd like to meet her. No point. She wouldn't come. Too many memories here. We could go out then, for lunch or something nice. We can't afford that. Grant rubbed his temples, wincing as if he was getting a headache. You're being childish, he said. Piss off! Brilliant rebuttal, that.
Grant snorted.
Come on, what's happened to the clever clogs I used to fancy the pants off? Use your big words. Look, you wanted me to call Mary, and I did. It ended badly like I knew it would, and that's that. Just leave me alone, will you? Yeah, I can imagine why it ended badly too, and I don't need to be a bloody magician to work it out. Wizard. Dickhead. From what you told me, she's a nice girl, and she knows you. I just thought she might be someone to talk to about... Yeah, well, she doesn't want to talk about it any more than I do. Remus spat. She told me to talk to you. She did. Grant blinked. Remus felt especially cruel. Well, obviously she doesn't know you by name, just whoever I'm shagging right now. Right. Grant made an obvious effort to ignore this slight. Well, come on then. What? It's a Sunday. I've got nothing to do. Let's talk. No. Remus, I can't go on like this, Grant said. I love you, I do, but this is too... Fuck. Alarm bells started going off in Remus's head. It was as if someone started flashing the lights on and off, and the walls were closing in, and all the air had left the room, and he was dizzy, drowning, blinded. There was a weird sick taste in his mouth, and he thought he might be sick, except he couldn't breathe enough to retch, just kept gasping, tumbling forward. Hey! 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 Grant's voice penetrated the fog, echoing in distant. Remus? Remus, can you take a deep breath? In 1, out on 2, okay? 1. Remus felt sweat trickle down his back, his heart thudding into overdrive, but he breathed in as much as he could. 2, Grant said. He was rubbing his back very slowly. Remus let off a long, shaky breath. That's so good, Grant said, voice louder now. So good, Remus, well done. And again. 1, 2. They must have sat there for a full 2 minutes, just breathing together. Eventually, Remus felt halfway normal again, except he really, really wanted a drink. See? Remus said, using the voice that Remus was sure he reserved for the troubled kids he worked with. This is why I need you to talk to me. We can't have this, can we? Remus shook his head, but didn't trust himself to speak. I'm sorry I said what I said, Grant continued. I didn't mean it. There's no buts, okay? I love you, and you're stuck with me. Remus nodded again, head still in his hands, eyes shut tight. He had to be getting the flu or something. People didn't get dizzy just from not talking, surely. Only Grant saying that I can't go on.
It had ignited such dread inside him, such terror. Maybe there was something to it.
What if you just tell me one thing? Grant tried. Just one thing to help me understand. Like what? Remus choked. Well, he could practically hear Grant's mind whirring. Did he have a list of things he wanted to pry out of Remus, all saved up for this education? Was this some stupid psychoanalysis bullshit Grant had picked up on a training course? You never told me what happened to Sirius. I know he's not dead. Did he... leave? Yeah, in a manner of speaking, Remus grunted. God, hearing someone else say his name hurt so much. He felt dizzy all over again. What you mean? He's in prison, Remus said. Then he breathed in again and forced out the rest. He's in prison because he murdered them, and I wasn't here to stop any of it. Fucking hell. Remus braced himself for more questions, but none came. Grant just slipped his arm over his shoulder and gave him a squeeze. It wasn't your fault. I know that, Remus returned, still looking down. You don't know how stupid I was. I missed all the signs. I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was just me, that he wanted to break up. I was so selfish. I never thought for a second that he could. He was crying now. Stupid Grant. It's his fault for letting you down, not your fault for trusting him. Grant kept hugging him. Remus allowed it to make him feel better, to make this seem like a breakthrough. But Grant could say all he wanted. Mary had said something similar once or twice over the years. It just didn't ring true. The dead were still dead, and Remus had not been there to prevent any of it. Even if he had been there that Halloween night, the way he'd been back then, he probably would have let Sirius kill him too, rather than try to fight him. Back then, dying for love seemed like the only worthy cause. Now he was older, and he knew the truth. Never again. Never, never. Chapter 179, 1987. In the spring of 1987, Remus had a spot of luck. One of Grant's old student friends now worked in the law department at UCL and managed to swing a job for Remus doing some freelance editing. This was a revelation. He could do the bulk of the work at home and then just take it up to Holborn once it was done. He did need to get a national insurance card and a Muggle bank account, but that was easy enough with a few tactical glamour spells at the bank. Remus only cheated a little bit, using magic to help him read and correct spelling, but he found the work surprisingly enjoyable and even started a little business marking exam papers for some of the local Muggle schools. "Dunno how you can concentrate for so long." Grant shook his head at the pile of papers Remus had amassed one evening. "I'd go out of me head." "It's interesting," Remus shrugged. "I never got the chance to learn any of this stuff. Have you ever heard of quadratic equations?" Grant laughed at him fondly and ruffled his hair. "You boffin." Grant himself had been going from strength to strength at work. He loved his job and put in extra time on the weekends and evenings whenever he could.
The boys Grant worked with were every bit as much trouble as the St. Edmund's boys, but that only seemed to spur Grant on. He was always telling Remus about one kid or another who had a little victory, a passing mark at school, a week without a fight, time off their sentence. Somehow Grant knew everything about everyone, his memory limitless, his capacity for pride and encouragement unbelievable.
"Got to cut out the article in the Observer," he might say one evening. "Sounds right up Alfie's street." Or, "Staying late tomorrow with any luck. Promised the older lads we'd have a kickabout if none of them got written up." When he was feeling insecure sometimes, Remus would wonder if Grant was only with him because he too was a troubled boy. That Grant was just trying to save him, like he tried to save everybody. He lived for a good cause. "Shut up," Grant would grin at him if he raised these concerns. "I've wanted to get in your pants since we were teenagers. Ain't got nothing to do with your troubled past." And then Remus would remember that, after all, Grant was a care-home kid himself, something which was easy to forget because, unlike Remus, he bore it lightly, with a casual shrug of acceptance. Poverty, lack of education, mistreatment, none of this weighed Grant down in the same way, at least not on the surface. But Remus had been wrong about people before. As a result of Grant's dedication to his work and Remus's own relatively low-impact employment, Remus found himself in a position he'd never been in before, having both free time and a bit of disposable income. He didn't need much. The flat was paid for, their furniture was serviceable, and they could generally afford to keep the electric and hot water on. He bought clothes every once in a while, but he hardly shopped at Harrods. There was the drink, but he reasoned that, as he didn't smoke anymore, he could put his tobacco money toward booze. What Remus did enjoy doing was going for walks. Not countryside rambles. He got enough of that on full moons. But wandering through London by himself, enjoying the streets, the people. He visited every free museum in London, the National Gallery, the Portrait Gallery, the V&A, the British Museum. He became quite cultured, in fact. And if his hip hurt, which it often did now as he entered his late 20s, he could easily hop on a bus. So one summer's day he'd completed all of his marking and there was nothing on TV.
Grant would not be home for hours, so he mooched round the Science Museum for an hour or so. Funnily enough, it put him in mind of Arthur Weasley, for the first time in years. The daft old bugger would love all these machines, the pistons, the light bulbs.
He could just picture Arthur's face as he watched the perpetual motion machine, and Remus smiled to himself quite out of the blue. How was Arthur? And his wife, the Pruitt sisters, and their red-haired brood? It had been too long now to get in touch, Remus knew, and he wouldn't know what to say even if he did. Still, thinking about the Weasleys hadn't hurt, which was the main thing, and perhaps thinking about them put him in a different mind frame for the afternoon. More alert, maybe, or nostalgic. It couldn't be a coincidence that he bumped into an old friend only 2 hours later. He was nearly home, only a street or so away, shuffling anonymously through the bustling Chinatown alleyways. In fact, he was just about to pass the place where they got their TV, the sauna off Old Compton Street. Remus always blushed a bit, walking past it, and then chastised himself for being such a prude. He ducked his head slightly as he approached, and, horror of horrors, just as he was level with the door, somebody stepped out of it. Remus had to stop short so as not to bump into them. They turned and stared up at him nervously. Remus gasped. "Christopher?" The man blinked, horrified. He was red-faced with dark brown eyes that were rather small and watery. He was a bit chubbier than he had been at school, and his hairline was receding slightly at the temples. But it was definitely him. "Remus?" "Hi, it's been—" "Not since—" "Yeah, how are you?" Remus winced even as he asked the question. Christopher was so clearly uncomfortable, and why shouldn't he be? He hadn't seen Remus in almost 10 years, and here he was, looming over him outside a gay sauna. "Oh, you know." Christopher looked at his feet. He was wearing muggle clothes, a stone-washed denim shirt with the buttons done up unevenly, dress trousers, and a burnt orange waistcoat with green embroidery. In short, he looked as dreadful as every pure-blood wizard who tried to pass as a muggle. As always, Christopher's general air of hopelessness endeared Remus to him. Remus rubbed the back of his head. "Do you want to, got time for a coffee or a drink? Catch up for a bit?" "Okay, then." Christopher looked up at him cautiously. Remus took charge from that point because it was clear there was no other way. He led Christopher further up the street, back towards Tottenham Court Road. There was a cafe on Denmark Street that was cheap and anonymous, and for some reason Remus wanted to get further away from home. "Here we are," he smiled kindly, holding the door open and pointing out an available table. Christopher said nothing and sat down, fidgeting a bit. Remus wondered if this was all a terrible idea. Maybe Chris didn't want to speak to him. But he went along with it and offered to pay when Remus went to order their coffees. "Do you live nearby?" Christopher asked finally, still not making full eye contact. "Yeah," Remus nodded. "Not far, you?" "Oh no, out in Hampshire. I just come into the city for work and, well—" "Where do you work now?" Remus asked, desperate to spare him any further embarrassment. "Gringotts," Chris said, glancing up at the waitress as their coffee arrived. He put 3 sugars in his and as much milk as he could. Remus realised he hadn't even asked if Chris liked coffee. "Very swish," Remus smiled. "Always knew you'd do well." "I suppose." "Still read lots." "When there's time. Work keeps me busy. And other responsibilities, you know how it is. I thought we were overworked during NEWTs, but Hogwarts was a holiday compared to real life." Remus chewed the inside of his cheek because it was very true, and he didn't want to get upset about it. "How about you?" Christopher asked, clearly trying not to grimace as he sipped his coffee. "What do you do now?" "This and that," Remus shrugged. "Haven't exactly got a career." "Oh, what a shame." Remus shrugged. "It's fine, I manage." There was an awkward silence. Remus wanted to ask about the sauna, but he knew better. Grant would probably ask, but then Grant had a way of putting people at ease, which Remus didn't. He just drank his coffee quietly and wished he'd suggested a pub instead. "I thought you died," Christopher said suddenly. Remus nearly choked. He set down his coffee. "You—" "There were so many rumours back then. You remember what it was like. And there were all these names. And then I saw what happened to Lily and your friend James. I just thought, especially after it came out that Sirius Black was the one who did it, I just assumed—" Remus breathed in sharply and waited for the pain to retreat. When it did, he exhaled slowly and said very evenly, "No, I wasn't there that night. I had no idea what Black was up to. No one did." "He was always up to something," Christopher said darkly. "And with his family. I suppose it didn't come as much of a surprise, really." "No," Remus said, not really knowing what he was saying anymore, just trying to ignore the roaring in his head. "I suppose not." "I was so upset about Lily, though. She was kind. Do you know where Harry is now? The boy who lived?" Remus just shook his head. He drank more coffee. Probably not a brilliant idea to add caffeine to his already speeding heart rate, but he was trying to be as normal as possible. "If you weren't dead," Christopher continued, "I thought you might not want to talk to me." "Why?" "I know you and your friends were all involved in the war, helping Dumbledore and everything. My parents sent me to Sweden after I finished my NEWTs. They were worried about me. They wanted me out of the way. You remember what things are like." "Yes," Remus wanted to say. "Yes, I bloody remember. Sometimes I wake up and it's like it's all still happening. And with us being purebloods, I think they were worried I'd have to pick a side, so they sent me away. We have family in Gothenburg, and I got my qualification in Muggle finance." "Right," Remus nodded. He really needed to talk about something else. "Good for you. So, are you in Soho often?" Christopher turned crimson again and looked down at his mug of coffee. Only sometimes." Honestly, I just heard about the place and thought I'd take a look. I don't want you to think...
You know you ought to be careful, Remus said, lowering his voice in case any of the cafe patrons were listening in.
There's this illness that muggles are getting. I'm not sure how much you lot know about it, but it's really serious. Like I said, Christopher said. I barely go there, really. Just stupid curiosity. Remus felt a twinge of guilt for making Christopher feel bad. If Grant had taught him anything, it was that you should never add to anyone's personal shame. It was a wasted emotion anyway. No need to make it worse. There's nothing wrong with being curious, Remus said gently. Lots of people go to those places. Do you? Christopher looked up at him. No, Remus said a bit too quickly. I was never very sociable. Oh, of course. I can imagine, after everything that happened. Remus didn't want to get on that, so he changed the subject. Seeing anyone? He asked. Got a boyfriend? Christopher shook his head. No, it's difficult, you know. The job I have, my family. Things have been, well, there's been a fair bit of trial and error in that respect. Remus wanted to squeeze his hand over the table, but it really wasn't the place. He tilted his head sympathetically. It'll get better, Chris. Christopher looked at him with a resigned smile. Yes, I remember you saying something like that before at school. Someone for everyone. There is, Remus nodded encouragingly. More than one person, even. I don't know, Chris sighed. I don't know if it's healthy to think like that. There are so many factors to consider, and I don't think it works like in books. I don't think everyone has that experience. That was a difficult thing to hear. Remus didn't know what to say, really, and felt weirdly self-conscious and naive. Certainly Remus did not glamorize romance anymore, if he ever had at all. Love had beaten the shit out of him on more than one occasion, but it had also been the only thing worth living for. It had lifted him, protected him, and kept him human. He had a sudden longing to see Grant and wondered if he'd be home yet. Don't feel sorry for me, Christopher said briskly, checking his pocket watch. I have a nice enough time. I like my work, I make plenty of money, and when I get a free evening, I still... I'm able to enjoy myself once in a while. I just see it as a treat rather than a lifestyle. Anyway, he leaned in a little. I have a flat in Kensington, for when I work late and don't want to apparate all the way home. It's nice there, if you'd like to see it. He raised an eyebrow suggestively. Remus's mouth went dry and he swallowed, flustered. Nice of you to offer, really, but I'd better be getting home. I've got someone waiting. Oh! Christopher sat up straighter, withdrawing. His face seemed to close up. You've got someone? Yes, for a few years. Almost 6, he realized. Longer than he'd had Sirius. If he'd ever really had Sirius. Well, good for you then. Look, I'd better go, Remus. It was very nice to see you again. Christopher stood up and extended a formal hand for Remus to shake. We ought to have a proper catch-up one of these days. Let me know if you're ever in Diagon Alley. Perhaps I'll arrange lunch. Okay, Remus nodded, shaking his hand. He knew he would never be in Diagon Alley, and as Christopher didn't give him any contact details, Remus assumed that the invitation was merely politeness. He did not miss pure-blood hypocrisy. Remus walked home quickly, ignoring the ache in his hip, and was relieved beyond belief to find Grant already there in the kitchen. Watch a boffin, he grinned. How was the museum? Good, thanks. Interesting. Reckon I should take some of the lads there on a trip, if I can get it past the governor. He held up 2 tins. Beans on toast, or spaghetti hoops on toast? Whichever you prefer, Remus said, watching him. Grant looked at them both cheerfully. Hoops, then. With lots of Worcester, eh? Sounds perfect, Remus breathed. Perfect, Grant chuckled. You must be hungry. No, I just missed you, that's all. I've only been at work. I know. Daft sod. Grant shook his head, still smiling, turning his back to the cutlery drawer to find the tin opener. Remus crossed the room quickly and hugged him, wrapping his arms round Grant's waist, pulling him in and inhaling the scent of him. Grant set down the tin opener carefully and hugged Remus back, rubbing his arms. "You all right, sweetheart?" Remus said into his neck. "Just glad you're here." Chapter 180, 1989. In 1989, Remus actually went to Oxford Street to do his Christmas shopping, on Grant's insistence. "You've never been?" he gasped, eyes wide. "You haven't even seen the lights?" "I didn't think proper Londoners got involved in all that nonsense," Remus replied defensively. "Proper Londoners leave the house," Grant said, "and buy presents for their friends." "I don't have any friends," Remus said, then felt awful, because of course he had Grant. "What about that Mary bird? Sends you letters all the time." "Oh yeah, I could get her something, maybe." "That's the spirit, Ebenezer." Remus shrugged off the teasing because he knew Grant loved Christmas, or any opportunity to celebrate really, and Grant had had a very difficult year. Having worked so hard to gain his school-leaving certificate, pushing every step of the way to get his A-levels and other various qualifications, all so that he could have his dream job, which was helping other people, Grant had finally come up against an insurmountable opponent. The government, more specifically, the Local Government Act. In 1988, Section 28 passed, and Grant was no longer secure in his position at work. Remus didn't really understand it at first, or at least couldn't see why Grant should have to worry. "You don't work for the council, though," he frowned, flicking through the leaflets Grant and his friends had been printing for awareness-raising. "Yes, I do," Grant replied. "Local authority includes schools and borstalls, and that's what it's really about. They don't want us perverting kids." "That's ridiculous," Remus said. "I know." Remus reread the text. "A local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship." "Pretended?" Remus shook his head. "I know," Grant sighed. "What does this mean, though? Promote homosexuality? How do you promote it?" "Well, that's where the cunts have been clever, innit?" Grant huffed. "It don't mean anything, not really. Just means if anyone wants to argue against it, it's the fucking Tories can accuse them of wanting to promote queerness or some bollocks." "But that's completely mental, evil, immoral, yeah."
My mate, Gay Bob, he's already had to shut down the gay youth support group. Only started that last year. And my place ain't exempt. The governor's already asked him for a list of books we carry. Check none of them are too queer.
They can't. They wouldn't sack you. "I don't know, love. I'm already trying to keep me head down over the AIDS thing." Remus felt even worse about that. The staff at the centre Grant worked at had all been hauled into a meeting one day and told in no uncertain terms that if any of them had contracted HIV, then they would be dismissed without notice and the police would be notified. That was terrifying enough. For the past 18 months, Grant had been working tirelessly with his friends and various groups to appeal Section 28, and it wasn't going well at all. He'd almost been arrested at one protest and caught a black eye off an anti-protester at another. "It's war," he said fiercely when he returned, and Remus made him sit still so he could heal it. "It's us and them. That's how they want it, and that's what they'll get." Remus didn't know what to say. He didn't want a war, he just wanted to be left alone. He never said that, though, because deep down he was very proud of Grant's barefaced refusal to give up or give in even an inch. He'd always admired bravery most of all. So in late December, Remus and Grant bundled themselves up in woolly hats, gloves and scarves, and walked through the wintry grey city to Oxford Circus. Grant was right, the prat. The lights were great. Strung across the wide street like jungle vines, great gleaming golden bulbs illuminated the cheerful red double-deckers, the shiny black cabs, the glorious silver and green window displays. It was true, Remus had been avoiding Christmas and all its trappings, just like he avoided his birthdays. He was worried they'd send him hurtling backwards, to Hogwarts, to the Potter's mansion, to all of his most bittersweet memories. It was very hard to be without his friends at that time of the year. But there was something very cleansing about the chaos of shopping in Oxford Street. The noise and the bustle and the smells ensured that he couldn't sulk for long, and Grant's enthusiasm for the season did the rest. Right, let's have a look for Mary's Prezi first, shall we? He grinned up at Remus, bouncing on the balls of his feet. House of Fraser, or she a Selfridge's girl? Whichever is trendier, I suppose, Remus said. What did you have in mind? God, I got no idea. Bath shit? Yeah, Remus nodded. Bath shit. Or perfume? Oh, perfume, eh? Grant nudged him at his elbow. That's intimate. Should I be worried? About Mary? Remus snorted. You'd be too late. They wandered through the perfume departments of 3 or 4 big department stores. Remus somewhat regretted his choice then. His hypersensitive sense of smell meant that he was already nursing a headache from the first stop. He eventually settled on something floral, in a pink and gold bottle, because it was pretty and stylish, and Mary was pretty and stylish. He even had it gift wrap, in gold with a red satin bow. Gryffindor colours, he smiled to himself. Right, you buy my present next, Grant grinned, tugging his sleeve. I want new socks. Mine have all got holes. Remus took a big gulp of cold, fresh air as they came outside, relieved. I've got to get you something better than socks, he said. Could do with some new Y-fronts too. Grant winked and Remus blushed, looking down. He'd get something really nice later on, when Grant wasn't looking. He wasn't sure what yet, and he didn't have a lot. But maybe a new coat might not stretch things too far. Grant was in dire need of a new one. His second-hand duffel barely kept the chill off. What you want? Grant asked, looking at a window display designed to look like the North Pole, with big, wild pillows stacked up to look like igloos and gigantic stuffed toy penguins. Chocolate, Remus shrugged. That's what I always get you. That's all I want now I don't smoke. Grant shook his head, tutting at Remus's temperance. Suddenly, Remus caught a whiff of magic. For a moment he wondered if his senses were just wrecked by all the perfume, but no, it was very clear. He looked up and down the street curiously. Then he saw him, standing outside Marks and Spencer's. Christopher, is that you? Remus approached slowly. Remus! Christopher turned, surprised. We have to stop meeting like this, Remus laughed. He was in a good mood, and at least he hadn't caught Chris in a compromising situation this time. Yes, quite right. Christopher laughed too, a little nervous clearing in his throat at the end. He was carrying several bulging shopping bags in both hands. So, how are you? Sorry I haven't been in touch. It's been ever so busy at work. That's okay, I'm well, he nodded. Christopher's eyes flicked toward Grant. Remus remembered his manners. Sorry, this is Grant, my, Better off, Grant finished with a cheeky grin, holding out a gloved hand. Christopher looked as though he didn't know whether to laugh along too, but he shifted his shopping bags to shake Grant's hand. Christopher Barley, he said. Chris and I were at school together, Remus explained. Oh, I see, Grant nodded eagerly, his eyes bulging. He never said anything about it, but Remus knew Grant was secretly dying to meet another wizard, just to compare. Live in London, do ya? No, just in for shopping, you know. Christmas. Us too. How nice, Chris said very formally. It was starting to get a bit weird. Remus felt like they were at a middle-class cocktail party or something, exchanging pleasantries. Chris, dear, there you are! A short blonde woman came trotting up the street in neat high black heels and a gorgeous ermine coat. She was tugging a little boy along by the hand. He looked about 5 years old, and he had Christopher's eyes. Can we go quite soon? There are too many muggles about. It's suffocating. Christopher avoided Remus's gaze and greeted the woman. Sorry, dear, I bumped into an old Hogwarts friend. He gestured vaguely. How lovely! She turned her red-lipped smile on Remus. She held out a tiny hand, and he took it awkwardly, not sure if he was supposed to kiss it. Darling, this is Remus and his friend Grant. Remus, this is Asta. Christopher mumbled. My wife, and Henrik, my son. Pleased to meet you, Remus nodded. Grant nodded too, but Remus could tell he was uncomfortable. It's a pleasure, Asta gushed. I have to say, I don't meet so many of Christopher's schoolmates. You must come for dinner one evening and tell me all about his mischiefs. Yeah, definitely. Remus laughed self-consciously, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't even know what he was saying. Christopher was married. He had a kid. Well, we'd better get going, Christopher said, his face weirdly blank. Merry Christmas, Remus. Merry Christmas. Remus gave an awkward wave as the family turned to walk away toward Diagon Alley. Is it just me? Grant said as they left. Or was that very strange? Very, Remus said. He must have met her in Sweden. He said his family sent him there. No, it weren't her that was strange, Grant said. No, I mean, Remus bit his lip. So I know Chris from school, but I've seen him since. About 18 months ago, coming out of that sauna in Soho. Oh, Grant said. Right, I get it. Poor bloke. He never said anything then. How old did the kid look to you? Older than 18 months, Grant shrugged. Yeah. It soon began to rain, icy cold December rain, so they ran for the next bus and went home. Remus often thought about Christopher after that, and it troubled him. There was nothing much he thought he could do about it, and really it was none of his business, but he didn't understand at all. Had Christopher been convinced? Coerced? Did he love her? Was he happy? By the time he and Grant got in from the rain, they were freezing and soaked through. They took a hot shower to warm up, then Remus lit a fire in the old flue connection to heat up the flat for Grant. How does that work when we ain't got a chimney? Grant asked, bringing in the tea. Magic, Remus yawned as Grant settled down beside him. I'm not that bloke in Bewitched married to the sexy blonde. I won't wiggle my nose, though. Oh, now I'll never leave you alone until you do, Grant grinned. Remus gave him a haughty look and pointed his wand at the radio. They were so cosy, it felt wrong to switch the telly on. Thanks for coming with me today, Grant said, wrapping his hands round his mug of tea to warm them. I know you hate crowds. I don't mind, really. Thanks for getting me out of the house, and showing me the lights. Any time, Grant snorted. Always cheers me up, Christmas shopping. You know no one's thinking about themselves, just making other people happy. It's nice. I thought you were against the commercialism of Christmas, Remus commented wryly. Grant elbowed him. I am, but some of it's still nice. Anyway, thought you'd like a break from the politics this weekend. Remus didn't respond, just kissed Grant's cheek and settled in to listen to the radio. The tail end of a Suzanne Vega song was playing. Love this tune, Grant murmured, leaning against his shoulder. Love her voice. All clear and weird. Know what I mean? It's a Greek myth, Remus replied drowsily. Odysseus. No, it's something to begin with a C, Grant replied, sipping his tea. Yeah, Calypso. She's the siren, but Odysseus is the main character. Siren? Isn't that like a mermaid? Sort of. They lure in men with their singing. Are they real? Grant asked. He always wanted to know. Yes, mermaids are. I don't know if Calypso was. What'd she do? They fall in love or what? Odysseus' story is called the Odyssey. It's all about his journey home from the Trojan War. Remus furrowed his brow, trying to remember. It was Homer. He'd read that in his second year, either before or after the Epic of Gilgamesh. He couldn't remember. He hadn't really liked the Odyssey. He preferred the Iliad, because it had all the good war stuff in it. Maybe he'd feel different now as an adult. The Trojans. Are they the ones with the wooden horse? Grant asked, still trying to follow the thread. Yeah, that's right. Odysseus gets into all sorts of trouble as he tries to get home to his wife, Penelope. But the sea god gets angry with him about something. Can't remember what. But he destroys Odysseus' ship and he washes up on this island where Calypso lives. She falls in love with him and holds him hostage for 7 years. What does she do to him? Oh, I don't know. Feeds him, heals his wounds and stuff. Think she dances a lot. She don't sound too bad. She sounds kind. Maybe. But she wants to make him immortal, and Odysseus wants to get back to Penelope. Calypso isn't his true love. Sort of sad, Grant huffed, sounding put out. It's just a story, Remus shrugged.
Thank you for watching. and a very special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon or check out some of the official Bibliobabuli merch. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and until the next video, happy reading.